Hey, this is Melissa Jurassic, assessing the case today of ex-spouses Daryl and Alice, Daryl being a former client, Alice being a current client, and how to proceed ethically. For stage one, the tug of war for me was between the principle of integrity versus the standards by which termination is allowable. Alice is not aware that I know more than she has disclosed about her relationship with Daryl. And according to the principle of integrity, I must be honest, trustworthy, and objective, being aware of any biases. So I do have a pre-existing image of Alice and Daryl's relationship, their separation, and their personal characters formed while treating Daryl. So how can I be objective in treating, or how objective can I be in treating her, rather? Should she discover that I've kept this secret, as it were, she may lose trust in me. So is it right to keep her as a client? So termination of services is only allowed under certain circumstances, but also requires an explanation, which I can't offer Alice because of confidentiality standards here as well. So should I continue to treat Alice knowing that her treatment may be subject to contamination from my bias? So for the values trap, Cotone, Davidas, and Hartley claim that psychologists' belief regarding household labour and gender roles in parenting can bias the psychologist's judgment. And I am glad that I read that article, because I am indeed a feminist, believing in equality and fairness, and value an authoritative parenting style very highly. Psychologists are also often subject to framing and anchoring biases when treating clients known to each other, and bias can then impact the effectiveness of treatment. So here I would likely be comparing the division of labour, the parenting styles, and overall their two perspectives, but anchoring and framing from Daryl's perspective, as I heard his first. So this violates a really strong value for me of effectiveness of treatment, and also my care for Alice. I want her to heal from her depression. I don't want to jeopardize her treatment, and I especially don't want to be the thing that jeopardizes her treatment. However, contradictorily, it's also a violation of my values of effectiveness and care for Alice to handball her onwards. But most of the time I take a consequential stance, but there is something that just feels wrong and disingenuous about both treating Alice while keeping the secret from her, but handballing her onwards. And there is, of course, a risk to my career and reputation either way, both of which I do value very highly, nearly as much as client care. So the greatest vulnerability I would argue here is Alice's mental health, given her struggle to seek help. She may spiral after being abandoned by a psychologist that she's come to trust. Further, a working alliance is a factor in positive treatment outcomes for clients. And I do have a duty of care here. So Alice's vulnerability is also a right. She has a right to effective treatment and a trusting relationship with her psychologist. Daryl also has a right to resume treatment with me at any point. So while that's a separate ethical dilemma, it's just something that needs to be considered for the future. As mentioned, Alice has a right to a sufficient explanation for termination of services and assistance with transference of services to another psychologist. So accidental breaches of confidentiality can occur by clients and psychologists, which set key terms leakages. So a vulnerability for all three of us is any one of us accidentally leaking private information, whether within or outside therapy sessions. So confidentiality is an endangered right for both Alice and Daryl, and I'm vulnerable to misconduct here. Duration of treatment is also a vulnerability. The longer Alice remains a client, the more likely they are to find out about each other's client status, and likely the more betrayed Alice would feel the longer the relationship persists. Myself, I'm vulnerable to misconduct complaints or disciplinary action, but I do also have the right to seek advice from a supervisor, as I'm doing here, provided I maintain anonymity. So the options are to continue treating Alice whilst ensuring self-reflection and discussions with a supervisor to minimise contamination, to terminate treatment with Alice citing a professional conflict of interest and assist Alice in transitioning to services with a colleague. So in continuing to see Alice, that would be positive because I have a rapport. We've already got plan and treatment goals established. And I'm also now aware of the potential for contamination and I can mitigate that. This would be maintaining the working alliance, which tends to predict positive therapeutic outcomes. Should Alice indeed find out, she may actually not react negatively. She may understand that I was bound by confidentiality standards and I couldn't disclose treatment with Daryl. She may choose to terminate or continue with treatment upon finding out, but either way, it would be giving the autonomy to Alice rather than making the decision myself. So the negative consequences of this choice remain as risks rather than definite. So throughout all my reading about biases, I was questioning whether contamination would actually prevent me from treating Alice successfully. There's many studies suggesting that biased attitudes in psychologists can indeed distort perception, diagnoses, and treatment. However, most of them are testing prejudiced attitudes of minority groups. So it's difficult to find literature on this exact dynamic and whether it predicts poor treatment outcomes. So contamination is not a definite negative consequence, just a risk. Again, reiterating potential for leakage, dissolution of the working alliance via loss of trust, and then disciplinary action for myself via the clinic manager. So in transferring Alice's treatment, something I found interesting is that the APS, actually contradicting their own code of ethics, suggests that in this exact situation, it's best to terminate services, as do Natwick and Shetke that I've read there. In transferring Alice's treatment to a colleague, she is then seeing a psychologist that is neutral and is not focusing on her and Daryl's relationship, but just on Alice's depression. We've already got established plan and goals in place, so we could pick up where we left off. Alice is treated objectively, and that upholds my duty of care to her long term. It minimises leakage. It ensures me against any clinical policies regarding conflict of interest. And we're also safe if Daryl decides to resume treatment with me at any point in the future. So again, literature on treatment outcomes with this specific dynamic is scarce, but there is likelihood of at least some contamination. And terminating without disclosing why, which is what the APS recommends, works well on paper, but in reality, Alice would be very upset and very confused by that without getting an explanation. So even with assistance to transfer services, she's under no obligation to adopt or continue a relationship with another psychologist. So a massive risk to Alice's mental health to transfer her onwards. She could also raise a complaint with the clinic manager or the PBA citing unwarranted termination, which would result in disciplinary action for myself. And lastly, it just morally feels like the wrong thing to do. So it's a decision that would weigh over my head for a long period of time. So of course, the right decision was to continue to treat Alice, but while remaining vigilant of contamination. So in terms of actions, I've documented this decision-making process as is recommended by Kuchar and Keith Spiegel. I will maintain a self-reflective diary separate from client notes, completely confidential, and will be reporting on my assessment, interpretation, and treatment of Alice's case in meetings with a supervisor to minimize bias and to keep me on track.